I can still see the tin bowl sitting under the little altar, its edge chewed by rust and time, the name pressed into the metal with a pocket knife long gone. The hut windows breathed warm air, and the incense ash on the stone dish hadn't moved in years. When I set the bowl down, it made a small sound, thin and clean, that carried farther than it should have in the green hush. I didn't lift my camera. I didn't have to. That sound is the only frame I trust. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. Most mornings at home began the same way back then, the damp smell of cedar coming off the fence, the straight laid out in pewter gray, and gulls working the wind above the marina. My street sits 3 blocks up from the water in Port Angeles on a rise where you can watch the ferry cut its white seam toward the islands. At 52, I've learned that quiet is a tool, not a luxury. I drank my coffee from a chipped Navy mug, read the barometer I keep by habit, and listened to the house settle. The winter had been long. Spring was soft-footed and slow to show itself. On good days, I believed I'd grown patient enough to wait it out. The studio occupies the garage, a long rectangle of plywood shelves and hard cases with stenciled labels. Lav Mike's Pelican, 1450. Archive drives, lined like soldiers in a second life. I kept everything coiled and wiped down, dust ruins gear and stories both. When I climbed the 3 steps from the kitchen to the shop, I could usually tell how the day would go by the smell. Fresh tape and epoxy meant building. Hot plastic meant editing. That spring it smelled like paper. The back table was spread with printouts, maps, photocopied memos, and one image I wouldn't leave under a stack, an old roll call typed, crooked, the corner. Water warped the letters, ghosted into the page like bruises fading. Alan sent that page with a note written in a hand I recognized from a different life. A neat teacher's scrawl honed over lecture halls. He'd retired from the circuit and stayed on at a state archive as a volunteer, content to catalog what other men had made. The first time I called him years back, he warned me he'd stopped chasing mysteries. "I label shelves now, Eli," he'd said. "It helps me sleep." But in March of 2018, he left a message instead of a bedtime. I found something I don't know how to file. I met him in a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse, the kind with a counter that still turns your elbows black from years of coffee spills rubbing into the wood. He wore a wool cap, even indoors, thin and careful with his movements. He slid a folder toward me, and I felt the weight before I saw what it held. That's a strange truth about paper. The more important it is, the more it weighs. "It's a POW roll call," he said. And a follow-up line in pencil I can't stop hearing in my head. He tapped the margin and did not read it aloud. We didn't talk about jungles or maps or any plan at all. We talked about the ethics of digging up stories that had been forced into sleep, who might be harmed by waking them, and who had been harmed by the long official silence already. When the waitress poured us another round and slipped a slice of lemon pie between us, Alan finally exhaled. "Every so often, the past drops a breadcrumb," he said. "This one looks fresh, and that frightens me." Deputy Claire Donnelly called me later that week from the county office where she files permits for people who do odd things outdoors. She's short, stubborn, and has that officer's tone that cuts straight to the line you're dancing on. "Tell me you're not flying blind, Mercer," she said. I told her I had a historian with a conscience, a linguist who could keep our notes honest, a survival lead who had carried men out of places without paths, and the sense to turn back if the compass spun. "Gear list," she said. "Insurance proof. Travel plan. And a promise not to call me from a satellite phone unless you mean it." It was as close to a blessing as she'll ever give. Lena came by the house that Friday with 2 paper sacks from Shane's Our Modest grocery downtown, where you bag your own, and the guy at the register knows your dog's name even if you don't bring the dog. She has a way of sliding into a room without fuss, and standing where the light is good. We spread the contents across the kitchen table, waterproof field notebooks, a collapsible kettle packets of rehydrated potatoes, a deck of cards in case the rain pinned us to our tents. She asked to see the roll call herself. I told her what it contained, but not the penciled line. I wanted her first read clean. She took her time. I watched the clock on the microwave count off a whole minute. When she finished, she turned the paper at an angle and traced a finger along the bottom where the type had stuttered. "Someone was trying to get this done before the ribbon ran out," she said. "Those days don't wait for a fresh spool." I liked how she saw the smallness and the truth. The rhythm of that week felt ordinary. I drove to the marine supply for paracord and a roll of rubber repair tape. I walked the trail out behind the high school where the air holds the bite of wet fur, testing my knees on the inclines I knew would grow meaner in heat. In town, pickup trucks idled along First Street with dogs leaning on their horns, and the old men at the barber shop argued about a high school ball player who could throw mid-80s. The same sedans nosed into the same spots in front of the pharmacy. Someone at the crosswalk reached for their hat as the wind turned. Port Angeles is the kind of place where your neighbor's porch light tells you about the weather before you open the door. I spent an evening with Mark on the back deck, laying kit in rows: med-roll tourniquet suture, kit iodine, water filter, dull-colored tarps, 2 machetes wrapped in canvas satellite locator, a compass you could hammer nails with, and a string of little bells he insists on for camp boundaries even when I roll my eyes. He gave the bells a quick flick and looked at me like I'd been the slow student in the class. "If you can't hear the wind, the bells will do," he said. "You don't argue with something that gives you a second chance." When Mark says a thing like that, he isn't selling it. He's placing it in your hand to keep. We checked batteries and watched forecasts. A low-pressure trough rode the Pacific like a drunk sea captain. The airport weather posted 48 degrees if at dawn, and predicted rain by noon. My mother used to say April here teaches patience. May just reminds you to keep your coat. While the printer worked through a long list of supply manifests, dull work that makes the dangerous parts possible. I studied the little details in the archive copy Alan had given me. Whoever typed that page had fed the paper crooked. There was a tracker's neatness in the column of names, and a bureaucrat's mercy in the one-line conclusion that closed the case. It bothered me how clean it read. Lives don't end on a single sentence. What I remember most from those preparation days are the small sounds. The slow click of the hard case latches, the soft slap of laminated maps as I laid them fender to fender across the truck, Lena's pencil whispering in the margin of her notebook as she translated a list of field phrases into a simple guide we could share. We never named what we were about to do as dangerous. We also didn't call it safe. We called it work and let the rest sit where it belonged. Alan stayed with us 2 nights before we flew out. He's a quiet guest. He rinsed his coffee cup and set it upside down in the rack. He folded the blanket on the back of the couch when he woke up a little too early and pretended he hadn't. We ate eggs and toast and didn't discuss the possible ends of the line we were about to follow. Instead, we talked about the ferry schedule, how the city finally fixed the pothole at the corner of Laurel and 2nd, and the way the paper mill's steam smells different at night when the air lays low. One evening we drove to the bluff and watched the ferry lights drift in with the dark. Alan kept his hands in his coat and his chin tucked into the scarf like he was guarding a thought that might slip out if he moved. "You ever get the feeling," he said finally, "that some places wait for you?" I didn't answer. I'm old enough to know that silence isn't empty. It's a container you pass back and forth until it holds the same thing for both people. We stood like that one more ferry long, and then we went home. Deputy Donnelly stopped by on her way off shift to drop a signed letter acknowledging our travel plan. She leaned on the doorframe and scanned the stacks with that practiced eye. "You've got redundancies," she said. It was praise delivered in her version of a frown. "Text me when you land. And if a storm looks like it wants to argue, let the storm win." I promised, and meant it. You tell the truth more often when the stakes won't let you lie. If there were early warnings, they showed up the way they always do in things you could excuse if you wanted to. The barometer fell and then dipped again hard like a heart restarting. A coil of paracord I just cut slipped itself off the hook and unwound across the floor in one slow sigh, leaving a blue line between my boots and the threshold. The light over the sink flickered once and held steady. Alan dreamed out loud a single name I didn't recognize, and when I asked him about it in the morning, he said he couldn't recall speaking. Later that day, the call with our pilot cut for 3 seconds. The silence was so complete I thought I'd dropped the phone. We picked up the last of our supplies in town. The kid at the register asked where we were headed. Mark told him somewhere hot and left it there. Out in the parking lot, the wind came up and lifted a paper receipt from under someone's wiper blade. It tumbled and snagged on the boot scraper by the door, the ink already blurring in the damp. I watched it a beat longer than it deserved, then bent and stuffed it into the trash where it belonged. That night, I laid out my clothes on the chair as if I were 10 again and needed help believing morning would come. Boots by the door. Passport and vaccination card in the front pocket of my carry-on. The little notebook my daughter gave me for field sketches, tucked next to the lens cloths. I never sleep well the night before we go. I listen to the clock and to the house and to a kind of silence you can't measure with a microphone. It isn't fear. It's something with less edge and more weight. Alan coughed once from the couch and settled. Lena's rental car ticked as its engine cooled out, front headrest piled with the scarf she always forgets and then remembers when the wind goes to work on her neck. Mark texted a single line, 0400, and a thumbs up I only saw after I'd clicked the lamp off. The town held its breath between streetlights. Somewhere down on the water, a buoy bell rang twice and stopped. I walked the house one last time because that's what you do before you leave the known for the unknown. You touch the things that prove you're anchored. The stove knob cool and certain, the window latch, the door deadbolt solid under the thumb. I set the porch light to a low amber and watched it warm the steps and the welcome mat into a small square of comfort. Then I stood there longer than I meant to hand on the switch, listening for a phone that didn't ring and a car that didn't turn the corner. The light held steady and the street stayed empty. I told myself it was just a quiet night before a long trip. In my gut, I knew it was the last ordinary hour we were going to get for a while. The morning we left felt like it had been drained of color. The clouds hung low and heavy over the strait, flattening the light until the whole town looked carved from pewter. Mark pulled into my driveway right on time, headlights cutting a path through the mist. I loaded the last case into the bed of the truck while Lena locked up the house behind me. Alan stood at the curb, shoulders hunched in a windbreaker far too thin for the chill. He kept checking his pocket, patting it like he was afraid he'd lost something important. When I asked, he just said, "Notes, though, I don't think he meant the kind on paper." We rode south to SeaTac mostly in silence. The road wound along the water-gray waves, keeping pace beside us. Alan watched them like they were trying to speak. It's a long habit of mine to measure the tone of a trip by the way the car fills the quiet. That morning it was dense, like the inside of a church before a funeral. Our flight out of Seattle stopped once in Honolulu for refueling, then again at Honiara, the capital of the Solomon Islands. The layover was a blur of diesel fumes and humidity that stuck to every surface. By the time we boarded the small prop plane for the final leg to the coast, the air felt thick enough to drink. The windows rattled with each pocket of turbulence. Lena leaned forward, pressed her forehead to the glass, and whispered something I couldn't hear over the engines. Mark gave me a look, half grin, half question, and mouthed, "Still want to do this?" I nodded, though I'm not sure it was the truth. When we landed, the heat hit us like a wall. The air tasted of salt and wet leaves. 2 local brothers, Tama and Rico, met us by the strip with a battered Jeep and a crate of bottled water. They didn't waste words, just loaded our gear and motioned for us to climb in. The road, or what passed for one, was a strip of mud lined with breadfruit trees and palms leaning over the edges like eavesdroppers. It took nearly 3 hours to cover 12 miles. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, the world felt sealed off from anything familiar. We set our first camp near what had once been an Allied outpost, just a scatter of rusted drums and concrete footings half swallowed by vines. Alan unfolded a laminated copy of the map fragment he'd found in that archive box, smoothing it with careful fingers. The ink was so faint it looked like a ghost of the original. He pointed to a small smudge near the bottom where someone had written Camp 14. Then, further west, a single penciled arrow, no label, just a direction. "This is what kept me awake," he said. "Too dangerous to follow. Imagine writing that in 1945 when everything was already dangerous." I thought about those words long after we zipped into our tents. The jungle made its own weather at night drips that sounded like footsteps whine that breathed in and out like a living thing. At first it felt like any field job mud mosquitoes, the slow rhythm of work. We spent the first 2 days surveying what was left of the camp itself. Most of it had sunk into the earth. The barbed wire was no more than a rusted seam beneath the moss. A few shards of glass caught the light where a mess hall window might have been. Lena found a piece of a sign buried under the soil, the letters barely visible. Area 14. She brushed it clean with the edge of her sleeve. Alan stood over her, reading the fragment like scripture. "You can almost feel how temporary it was meant to be," he murmured. By the 3rd day, we began moving west, following the arrow from that penciled note. The jungle grew thicker, darker. Mark took the lead machete, cutting a narrow corridor through the green. He stopped often, scanning for snakes or drop-offs. I trailed behind him with the camera, though after a few hours I stopped filming altogether. The lens fogged faster than I could wipe it, and something about the stillness made the act feel wrong, like recording a prayer. Around midday, Tama signaled for us to stop. He'd found something in the underbrush, thin bamboo stalks cut and arranged in a way that wasn't natural. They formed a kind of ladder, rotted but still intact. He looked at me and said quietly, "Old work." That night, over a small cooking fire, Alan read from one of his notebooks, piecing together everything he knew about the camp. It was meant to hold the captured who wouldn't talk, he said. 6 of them vanished during a storm. No violence, no witnesses. The search stopped at the southern fence. He looked up at us, then his face flickering orange. That's where the arrow begins. The fire popped. Beyond the circle of light, the jungle clicked and hummed, restless. I remember Lena's expression. She wasn't afraid exactly, just listening, her head tilted like she was trying to hear something none of us could. On the morning of the 4th day, the forest changed again. The ground underfoot turned from soft loam to a mat of tangled roots. The air smelled of iron and wet stone. Mark crouched beside a tree trunk that had been shaved smooth on one side, the wood scarred with deliberate cuts. "Not storm damage," he said. "Somebody worked this." A few yards ahead, Rico found a series of stakes driven into the ground, lashed with vine, like the remains of a small fence or barrier. Alan's hands trembled as he reached for them. 70 years, he whispered more to himself than to us. And they're still standing. By then, we'd gone farther west than any of the old maps recorded. GPS flickered in and out, the signal useless under the canopy. We measured progress by sun angles and the taste of the air. Around mid-afternoon, Mark called us over. In the crook of a fallen banyan, he'd uncovered something metallic. It was half-buried, rusted, but unmistakably shaped by human hands. We washed it with canteen water until a faint engraving appeared on the bottom, Japanese characters, uneven but clear. Lena bent close, tracing the grooves with her fingertip. "Private First Class Shiro Tanaka," she said. The name hung between us like a note still ringing. Alan exhaled slowly. He was one of the 6. For a long while, none of us spoke. The jungle seemed to draw tighter around us, every leaf holding its breath. I felt the camera strap biting into my neck, realized I'd been gripping it too hard. We set the mess kit in the center of our small camp that night as if it deserved its own firelight. Alan kept staring at it, his eyes reflecting the flame. "He ate from this," he said softly. "He lived long enough to leave it behind." Lena wrote a single line in her notebook, proof of passage. Sleep didn't come easy. The forest had its own language after dark, soft thuds like fruit falling, the sharp rasp of insects, the deep exhale of wind through layered leaves. Around midnight, Mark's motion sensors chimed once, then stopped. He checked them and found nothing disturbed. Still, he stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting near the embers, knife across his knees. When morning came, the mist felt different, heavier. We moved quietly, no one in a hurry to speak. Around noon, Mark raised a hand, signaling stop. Ahead of us, the wall of green ended abruptly. Vines parted under his blade, and suddenly we were standing at the edge of a clearing so still it felt unnatural. Sunlight dappled through the canopy, lighting a small rise dotted with structures. 6 huts, built on stilts, their roofs sagging but intact. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something sweet, fermented fruit maybe, or incense long burned away. We approached slowly, boots sinking into the damp earth. Every step felt like trespass. The first hut's doorway hung open, curtain of vines swaying slightly in the breeze. Inside, the floor was swept clean of debris as if someone had done it recently. A pair of wooden sandals sat neatly by the threshold. On a low shelf rested a clay stove blackened by use. I filmed for a few minutes, hands shaking harder than I wanted them to. Alan called from another hut. He'd found a small shrine built into the wall, a photograph tucked into the frame. A young woman in a kimono, her smile faded to sepia. Beside it, an incense bowl thick with ash. On the ground lay a note sealed in oilskin. Lena opened it with careful hands and began to translate aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we are not found," she read, "let it be known we lived, we endured, we remembered home." No one said a word after that. We spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, counting 6 huts in all, arranged in a rough half-circle facing east. They weren't temporary shelters. They were homes. Inside one, I found a comb carved from wood, its teeth smoothed by years of use. In another, a knife blade made from what looked like aircraft metal. Lena discovered a bound journal, the cover warped but the pages mostly intact. The ink had bled in places, yet the handwriting flowed steady and deliberate. Dates ran from 1945 to 1951. She translated fragments aloud, lists of planting cycles, hunting notes, weather entries, even brief mentions of ceremonies. These men hadn't just survived. They'd built a rhythm, a life. As daylight faded, we gathered near the central hut. The air turned gold, and the forest seemed to retreat into its own hush. I asked Alan what he thought happened here. He didn't answer right away. He ran a hand over the wooden post beside him, eyes far away. "They stopped being prisoners," he said finally. "Maybe that was the only way to keep living." When the sun dipped below the canopy, the clearing dimmed into shadow. Mark suggested we camp 100 yards back away from the huts, out of respect more than fear. As we packed up, I noticed something on the far edge of the village, a smaller structure nearly collapsed, half hidden under vines. I pointed it out and Alan nodded. "We'll check it tomorrow," he said. But even then, standing in that twilight air, I felt the pull of it like a secret waiting its turn. That night I lay awake listening to the insects pulse in waves, wondering about the 6 men who vanished into this same darkness 70 years before. The wind moved through the trees with a slow sigh. Every so often it carried a sound that wasn't quite the jungle, something softer, more rhythmic, almost like distant voices. I told myself it was the mind playing tricks after too long in the field. Still, when I closed my eyes, I could see the sandals by the door waiting for feet that never came home. The morning light in that clearing came slow, like the jungle had to think about it first. The air was heavy but not unfriendly, thick with dew, and that deep green smell you only get when everything around you is alive and watching. I woke to find Mark already up, crouched by the fire pit from the night before, sharpening his knife with long, even strokes. Lena sat near the edge of camp, writing quietly, her hair pulled back, eyes moving from her notebook to the huts beyond. Alan hadn't said a word yet. He was sitting on his pack hat in his lap, staring at the smallest of the 6 structures, the one nearly collapsed, half-eaten by vines. We hadn't gone near it the day before. None of us had said we were avoiding it, but we were. Even then, before we knew anything, something about that hut felt different, like it had been waiting for us all along. We approached it after breakfast. The ground in front of it was soft sunken. The door hung by one hinge. The roof sloped, and the air that drifted out carried the faint, dry scent of ash. Inside, the floor was covered in fallen leaves and mold, but under the rot was a shape, a dark patch that had once been a mat or a sleeping roll. Alan leaned in, flashlight steady, and picked up a fragment of cloth faded to gray, its edges scorched. He turned it over in his hands, eyes narrowing. "Military weave," he said. "Japanese issue." Lena crouched beside him, careful not to disturb the floor too much. Near the wall, she spotted a piece of paper half buried under debris. When she pulled it free, part of it disintegrated in her fingers. The rest was blackened on one edge, the way paper looks when someone changes their mind about burning it. She smoothed it against her thigh, and I watched her expression shift. Curiosity, confusion, then something like unease. "Only a few lines are legible," she said. "It says, 'I cannot stay. I have seen what they are becoming. This is no longer survival.'" We stood there for a long time, listening to the insects hum and the slow creak of the trees overhead. Mark took the flashlight and swept it across the corners. There was a bent rifle leaning against the back wall, its barrel crushed flat, like someone had hit it against a rock. Beside it lay a string of small beads, hand-carved, tied together with vine fiber. They looked like a rosary, but the beads were uneven, irregular. Bone, maybe. No one said the word, but it hung in the air between us. Alan finally exhaled and stepped outside. "Someone left," he said almost to himself, or was made to. We regrouped near the main huts as the day climbed toward noon. The sun hit the clearing in pieces through the canopy, warm and golden, but I felt cold. I kept looking back toward that smaller hut, wondering who had slept there and what he'd seen that drove him away. Lena started cataloging artifacts with deliberate focus, the way people do when they're trying to hold something inside. Alan went back to the journal we'd found earlier, flipping through the fragile pages like he was reading a confession. He murmured the name softly. Tanaka Sato, Ichiro Kenji Nakamura. 5 men. No mention of a 6th. Every entry after late 1948 referred to we and us, but never by number. It was as though one man had simply been erased from their story. By early afternoon, we'd begun mapping the perimeter of the site. That's when Mark called out again. He'd been tracing a faint path that ran beyond the huts and up toward a ridge. At first glance, it looked like an animal trail, but halfway up the slope, the pattern changed. The ground flattened out into deliberate terraces, the kind used for planting. There were rows of old stones laid out in lines, a few still holding bits of dark, rich soil. Whatever they'd grown here had been planned, tended. Bananas, maybe, Terrell Mark said. These guys were farmers by the end. It hit me then that these men hadn't just hidden from the world, they'd built their own. They'd carved out a rhythm inside a place that should have swallowed them whole. The deeper we looked, the clearer it became. Near the far end of the terraces was a pit lined with rock, a kiln or oven blackened by old soot. Close by, we found more tools, blades hammered out of metal scrap wires twisted into fishing snares and what looked like part of an airplane fuselage bent into a makeshift roof panel. Lena translated a few lines from the journal later that day, describing rain catchers made from split bamboo and rotations for tending the gardens. There were notes about the moon cycle's hunting routes, even passages about rituals, something called the Night of Listening. Alan thought it referred to prayer or meditation, but the tone in the writing changed around those entries. The words grew clipped, almost paranoid. Toward dusk, Mark and I hiked a short distance up the ridge to get a better view of the clearing. From above, the village took on a shape that wasn't obvious from the ground. The huts weren't scattered, they formed a semicircle around a central point, and behind that point, a low wall of bamboo fencing zigzagged through the brush, reinforced with sharpened stakes. The pattern repeated in several places like a layered defense. "They fortified this place," Mark said, voice low. "Not against animals." He crouched, brushing leaves from what looked like a pit covered with branches and old vines. Underneath was a frame of bamboo and sharpened sticks, still dangerous despite its age. They were ready for something. We climbed back down before dark. The jungle turned a deep indigo as we returned, the air cooler thick with the smell of wet earth. Alan and Lena had laid out the journal and the note side by side, comparing handwriting. The charred letter from the hut was written in a looser hand, less controlled than the careful script in the journal. 2 different writers, Lena said. The one who left the letter wasn't the one keeping the record. Alan nodded, which means he might have been writing about the others. That night none of us spoke much. We sat around the fire eating quietly from tin cups, the jungle humming its low, steady tune. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called 3 times. Lena looked up from her notes. "They wrote about drums," she said softly. "He said they returned at night." Her voice caught slightly on the next line. "He said they kept watch until morning." The fire cracked, sending a brief shower of sparks into the dark. Mark stirred the coals with a stick, his face unreadable. "Maybe it was local tribes," he said. "Or maybe something else." I didn't answer. I just kept listening to the silence between the sounds, trying to imagine what it would feel like to live here for years, with only 5 other souls waiting for something unseen in the trees. Before we turned in, Alan asked me to film the site under the full moon. "It helps the perspective," he said, though I think he just wanted proof that it all existed outside our own memory. The moonlight cut through the canopy in long, pale ribbons, bathing the huts in silver. When I looked through the lens, they seemed almost new straight lines, clean angles, the suggestion of smoke still curling from the clay oven. I caught movement on the edge of the frame, once a shadow, maybe wind, but I didn't mention it. When I played it back later, it wasn't there. The next morning we went back to the shrine. Lena had been cleaning around it with a soft brush, exposing more of what lay beneath the moss. Under the base, she found a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with a strip of uniform fabric. Inside was another letter perfectly preserved. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. "Dearest Mother," it began. The words that followed stilled all of us. The man Sato wrote that they had survived, that they had built something new, but that they were changing in ways he couldn't explain. "We have forgotten the war," Lena translated, "but not the fear. It lives with us now. The forest watches, and it never sleeps." Alan's eyes glistened as she read. He wasn't writing from madness, he said quietly. He was writing from understanding. We packed that letter last, sealed in a protective sleeve, and logged every detail. The sun broke through the canopy just as we finished flooding the clearing with gold. It should have felt like triumph, but it didn't. None of us said it, but we all felt the same unease. For every answer we'd found, 3 more questions had taken its place. What had frightened them enough to build defenses in the middle of nowhere? Why had one man broken away, his name erased, and why, after all those years, had they vanished again, peacefully, deliberately, without a trace? That evening, as the light faded, we decided to stay 1 more night before heading back to the coast. Mark insisted on setting fresh motion sensors around the perimeter. "Just habit," he said. Alan spent the last of the daylight sketching the huts, his pencil scratching softly on the paper. Lena wrote in her journal by the fire, her handwriting steady, but her expression far away. I walked the perimeter one last time, filming in short bursts, capturing the way the moonlight filtered through the canopy and caught the edges of the huts. Everything looked still undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, not in a threatening way, more like the air itself was aware of us. When I returned to camp, the others had already settled in. The fire was low, the night pressing close. Somewhere beyond the line of trees came a soft, rhythmic sound, faint almost like a drumbeat carried on the wind. Mark froze, listening. "Could be branches," he said finally, though his tone wasn't sure. Alan looked up at the sky, his face pale in the light. "Or maybe the past isn't done talking," he murmured. None of us answered. We just sat there, letting that sound rise and fall until it faded into the night. Sleep came late. The forest kept whispering, and I couldn't tell anymore if it was inside my head or all around us. Somewhere in the dark, a branch cracked, slow and deliberate. I turned toward it, but there was nothing there. Still, I remember thinking, not fear exactly, but recognition that whatever had built this place might still be watching, waiting to see if we understood what they'd left behind. The sound that woke me wasn't the drums this time. It was the kind of stillness that presses against your ears until you realize what's missing. The jungle is never truly quiet. It breathes. It hums. Even when you can't see it, you can feel it moving. But that morning it felt as if something had stepped between us and the world, muffling every sound. I opened my tent flap and saw Alan already standing outside, his shirt half-buttoned, staring toward the ridge. Mist clung to the trees, low and gray, curling around the huts like smoke. Mark was by the fire pit, scanning the perimeter. Lena sat cross-legged beside the shrine, her notebook open on her knee. The last letter from Sato laid carefully beside it. Her lips were moving silently as she read the Japanese words again and again, as though she were trying to memorize the rhythm of a man's fear from 70 years ago. We broke camp slow that morning. No one wanted to say it aloud, but we were all waiting for something, some sign that the noises from the night before had an explanation we could live with. By the time the mist burned off, it was clear none was coming. Mark led us back toward the ridge to map the last section of the village. The climb was slick roots twisting underfoot. When we reached the top, the view opened into a narrow rise overlooking the clearing. From there, the whole settlement looked smaller. 6 huts crouched beneath a canopy of green, the shrine at the center catching a sliver of sunlight. But what caught Mark's attention was off to the right, a platform built high into the crook of a fig tree, almost invisible until the wind shifted the leaves. He climbed halfway up before I could stop him, boots sliding against the damp bark. "It's a watchtower," he called down. "Rotted rope, but the design's solid." When he reached the top, he leaned over and held something up, a whistle carved from wood blackened with age. "They had lookouts," he said. "They were guarding something or waiting for something to come back." Back on the ground, Alan was kneeling beside another pit covered with vines. He brushed the debris away with his hands, revealing a frame of bamboo sharpened to points. "They built traps," he said quietly. "These weren't for hunting. Look at the size. The stakes were too thick, the spacing too wide. Human, not animal." A few yards farther, we found stones stacked in neat mounds, throwing positions maybe. And along one section of the inner wall, we uncovered something worse, a spearhead carved from bone. Its surface was polished pale and unmistakably shaped by hand. Mark held it up to the light and turned it over slowly. "This is human," he said. No one answered. There are moments when every person in a group feels the same thing at once, and the air between them tightens like a pulled wire. That was one of those moments. Lena knelt near the shrine later that afternoon, cleaning around its base again. I saw her pause, the brush frozen mid-stroke. She'd found a thin string of folded paper tucked beneath one of the stones, tiny cranes, each no bigger than a thumbnail. She brushed one open gently with her finger and looked up at Alan. "They prayed here," she said. "They built this not out of superstition, but out of need." Alan nodded, eyes distant. They lost their country, their army, maybe their language by then. All they had left was ritual. He pointed to the ochre mark above the shrine, a sun symbol faded but visible. They were building a new world out of the memory of an old one. The journal told the same story, though darker as it went on. Lena translated another passage as the sun dipped low. "The drums return at night. We keep watch until dawn. Kenji says the spirits are testing us." Another entry weeks later. Ichiro fears Nakamura. He does not sleep. He carves in the trees when he thinks we do not see. We didn't know what that meant until Rico called us over near the north edge of the clearing. A tall tree stood there, its bark scarred with strange repeated markings, lines, and symbols gouged deep and overlapping, stretching upward as far as a man could reach. There were at least a dozen of them, all carved by the same hand. Lena traced one with her thumb. "They're not words," she said. "More like warnings. Or maybe prayers." Alan exhaled through his nose. Maybe the same thing by then. As evening came, the forest began its usual chorus, but it felt different, closer, heavier. We built a small fire near the shrine, our last night there, or so we thought. Mark sat apart from the group, checking the sensors again, though we all knew it was more about reassurance than safety. Alan stared into the flames, his face drawn and tired. "If they were 5 at the end," he said slowly, "then something happened here. Something broke them. I didn't ask him to explain. We'd all felt it. The 6th hut, the traps, the carvings, it added up to a picture we didn't want to finish drawing. Around midnight, I woke to the faint smell of smoke. Not campfire smoke, something older, sharper. I stepped outside and saw the jungle lit by moonlight, the clearing silver and still. The fire had burned down to embers, but a thin column of haze drifted near the collapsed hut. I walked closer, camera in hand, heart hammering. The smoke wasn't new. It was the residue of something disturbed. I crouched, brushed the soil with my fingers, and found a patch of ground still warm. Behind me, a twig snapped. I turned fast, light sweeping across the trees, but there was nothing there, only the sound of the canopy shifting overhead. I stood there for what felt like minutes before I heard Alan's voice behind me, low and calm. "Go back to the fire, Eli." He didn't ask what I'd seen. He already knew there was nothing I could explain. At first light, we returned to the shrine. None of us spoke. Alan moved the stones around its base carefully, as if drawn by instinct more than plan. Beneath the lowest layer, wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with a strip of uniform fabric, was another letter, this one untouched by time. The handwriting was careful, almost elegant. Lena sat down cross-legged, smoothed the paper, and began reading aloud. "Dearest Mother, I write to you with hands that no longer remember the warmth of home. We are alive. We have survived. But I do not know if we can be called men anymore. We have forgotten the war, but not the fear. It lives with us now. Tanaka still sings when he cooks. Kenji prays at sunset, but the forest watches, and it never sleeps. I see things I cannot explain. I hear voices in the leaves, and still I stay, because I must. Because we are ghosts now, Mother. But we live as men." When she finished, no one spoke. The jungle itself seemed to hush. Alan knelt beside her, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the paper. "This wasn't a confession," he said quietly. "It's testimony." He wasn't afraid of what they'd become. He was accepting it. Lena folded the letter gently, sealing it back into its sleeve. "Then what happened after she asked?" Alan shook his head. "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." We spent the next several hours documenting everything we could. Mark logged coordinates. I took photographs of every carving, every tool, every trace of their lives. Lena copied down the letters by hand so that if we lost the originals, their words would still exist in her script. When it was done, we stood in a small circle around the shrine. No one wanted to pack the last crate. We knew once we did, we'd be leaving more behind than we were taking. That evening, as the sun bled through the trees, we held a quiet fire. No cameras, no notes. Just the four of us sitting in the same circle those 6 men might have sat in decades earlier. Mark laid a handful of dry branches on the flames. Lena tied a red string around a small waxed bundle and placed it beside the shrine, a note she'd written herself. You were not forgotten. Alan added the cleaned mess kit engraved with Tanaka's name, resting it carefully on the stone. I took one of the photographs I'd printed from my camera, a frame showing the huts bathed in morning light, and slipped it into the ashes. The fire caught it slow, curling the edges until it disappeared. The jungle watched as it always had. The air around us felt alive but not threatening, like it was listening. When the fire died down, Mark poured water over the coals and the steam rose in soft spirals. The clearing dimmed into twilight, the huts behind us, just shadows now. Alan spoke once more, barely above a whisper. Every story ends twice, he said. Once when it happens, and once when someone remembers. Then he looked at me. You're the one who remembers, Eli. Don't let them fade. We left the village as night began to fall, walking in single file down the narrow trail that led back toward the river. None of us looked back. Not out of fear, out of respect. Behind us, the light from the fire flickered one last time, a faint pulse in the dark, then vanished completely. By the time we reached the base camp near the old airstrip, the moon had risen high and pale, and the jungle had swallowed our footprints. I thought that would be the end of it. The discovery, the letters, the quiet closure history rarely gives. But the jungle has a way of keeping its own promises. 2 months later, back home in Port Angeles, I got a message from Mark. He'd retrieved one of the motion cameras we'd left behind at the clearing. It had recorded just one image, a single frame at dawn, the huts faint in the mist. Between 2 trees stood a shape, tall and narrow, facing the empty village. The outline was human, but not quite. When I looked closer, I realized it wasn't the figure itself that unsettled me. It was its posture. It wasn't hiding. It was standing guard. I didn't reply to Mark's message right away. I just sat there at my desk, staring at the frozen frame, thinking about Sato's last line, "The forest watches, and it never sleeps." For the first time, I wondered if the watching went both ways. Back home, the air felt too still. The hum of the refrigerator, the seagulls over the marina, the ferry horn carrying across the strait. Ordinary sounds, but they didn't feel ordinary anymore. I unpacked the crates in my garage studio the same way I've done 100 times before, only slower this time. Each object came out of its wrapping like something alive, the mess kit with Tanaka's name etched deep into the metal, the photographs of the huts in that strange green light, the folded copy of Sato's letter. I set everything on the workbench and just stood there a while, listening to the rain tick against the roof. The smell of wet cedar came through the door crack. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I heard the first drip hit the floor from the sleeve of my rain jacket. Alan called that night. His voice was softer than I remembered, maybe smaller. "The museum wants to take the artifacts," he said. "They'll store them under controlled conditions, maybe mount a small exhibit if the funding comes through." I could tell he'd already said yes. He'd spent months of his life cataloging ghosts. It made sense he'd want to give them a home. "What about the families?" I asked. He paused. "Some have been contacted. One woman, Shiro Tanaka's sister. She's in her 80s now. When they showed her the photo of the shrine, she cried. Not from sadness, she said, from relief." The line went quiet except for the static of distance. Then he added almost to himself, "I think they were waiting to be found, Eli." just not by soldiers. The footage went public a few weeks later. I wasn't prepared for how quickly it spread. A few frames of moss-covered huts, the shrine bathed in gold, and that single name engraved on steel, it was enough to ignite everything. News anchors, bloggers, historians, they all wanted to define what we'd found. Some called the men fugitives. Others said monks. The word ghosts kept surfacing as if the world needed that distance to make sense of them. The comment sections filled with theories. Every time I saw the word coward, I thought of the terraces they'd built, the handmade blades, the letter to a mother who would never read it. Cowards don't build gardens in the jungle. Alan spent his days fielding questions from journalists who'd never known the weight of that heat, the smell of rot and rain mixing in your lungs. Lena took a quieter route. She returned to Japan for a short time to translate the letters properly and meet with the descendants. She sent me a message from Tokyo, just a photograph of the typed translation with one line underlined. "We have forgotten the war, but not the fear." Underneath she'd written, "Maybe that's what survival means." Mark tried to downplay it all like he always does. "People romanticize what they don't understand," he said when we met for coffee at a small diner off Highway 101. "Those men weren't heroes or villains. They were just trying to make it one more day without losing themselves." He stirred his cup, watching the cream twist through the dark. "But the thing that gets me," he went on, "is that they stayed together, even when they had every reason not to." I nodded. We didn't talk about the motion camera until we were both halfway through our pie. He slid his phone across the table, the image already open, that same frame, that same figure standing between the trees. It looked less human each time I saw it, and more like a shape the forest itself had decided to form. "Could be a shadow," I said, though neither of us believed it. He smiled, tired. "Yeah, could be." Then he locked the screen and said nothing else. The governments on both sides, Japanese and Australian, opened inquiries. Not criminal ones. There was no one left to punish. It was more a gesture of respect, an attempt to close the file properly after 70 years of silence. The artifacts were authenticated, the letters verified, the journal preserved in digital form. Families were contacted, some surprised, some unwilling to revisit the past. One woman wrote to the team through the museum, "He left as a soldier. If he died as a farmer, that is enough." That line stayed with me. I kept reading it aloud at night, the way you might read scripture. Months passed. The noise around the discovery began to fade the way stories always do once they've been categorized and filed away. Alan retired for good, his notebooks now part of an archive that bears his name. Lena accepted a university post teaching cultural translation. Mark went back to survival training, though he told me he doesn't take contracts in jungles anymore. As for me, I stayed here by the water working through hours of raw footage that I still can't decide what to do with. Every time I press play, I hear the same small sounds, the buzz of insects, the click of Mark's compass. Alan's breathing when he crouched to study something fragile. None of it feels like history. It feels like the present caught inside a loop. Last summer, a memorial was held in Tokyo. The museum displayed the restored artifacts for 1 week before moving them into long-term storage. Families lit candles beneath framed photographs. Alan attended by invitation, sitting in the back row, his head bowed. When they read Sato's letter aloud, the room went still. Even through the live stream, I could hear the hush, a sound heavier than silence. The letter ended with the line that had become a refrain for me. "We are ghosts now, Mother. But we live as men." There's no better eulogy than that. Sometimes when I think about those 6 men, I picture their last evening in that clearing. The fire burning low, the jungle breathing around them. Maybe they prayed. Maybe they just listened. I imagine the air heavy with the smell of smoke and damp leaves, the same scent that clung to us when we left. I don't know if they died there or if they walked deeper into that green labyrinth and became something the world couldn't name. But I know this, they were never lost. They simply stopped needing to be found. I still keep the mess kit on a shelf above my workbench. It's cleaned now, polished, but I've never tried to restore it beyond that. The scratches, the dents, they're part of its truth. Sometimes when the rain hits the roof just right, I hear a sound like the soft ring it made in that clearing when I set it back under the shrine. I used to think the jungle was warning us to leave. Now I think it was thanking us for listening. A few months ago, a local museum in Port Angeles asked to screen a short version of the documentary. They wanted to pair it with a veterans oral history project. I told them I'd think about it. I've made films my whole life, but this one feels different. It's not mine anymore. It belongs to time, to the families, to the people who lived and died between silence and survival. Still, I might let them show it just once, not to explain, but to remind. Every story leaves something behind. For us, it was that single image on the motion camera, a figure between two trees watching the huts as the dawn broke. Experts said lens distortion pareidolia. I don't argue. But sometimes, late at night, I pull that frame up on my monitor and I look at the way the shoulders slope, the way the head tilts slightly toward the shrine. Whoever or whatever it wasn't facing us. It was looking back at the place we left behind. The forest out there has probably reclaimed everything by now. The vines would have swallowed the roofs the terraces lost under moss. Maybe the shrine still stands, or maybe it fell quietly one stone at a time. Either way, it's still there in its own way. Some places never vanish. They just fold into the landscape waiting for someone else to stumble across them and listen. When people ask me what I think happened to those men, I tell them the truth. I don't know. Maybe they found peace in that green silence. Maybe they became part of it. What matters is that for a brief moment we heard them. We gave their story back to the world, and that's more than most of us get. I drive out to the water most evenings now. I park near the bluff and watch the ferries cut across the gray surface until they fade into the mist. The sea has a way of erasing tracks, but keeping echoes. That's how I think of the jungle now, endless, indifferent, yet somehow merciful. It keeps what it finds. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. And if you've ever walked through a quiet place and felt a story still hanging in the air, let me know where you're listening from. Every voice helps keep their memory alive.